That is day 5,523. And that tonight, yes, we are hosting acclaimed foreign correspondent and Milwaukee native, Jacob Kushner. However, before we get started with his introduction, though, I just wanted to welcome Jessica to the front. She's going to say a few words about Voces de la Frontera, which has partnered with us to provide tonight's event.
Well, hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Boswell Books. So my name is Jessica, and I am part of the team at Voces de la Frontera. Quick show of hands. Has anyone heard of Voces, maybe? Oh, wow. That's great. That's awesome. Well, I'm so thankful to see how many people turned out and how many people are ready to engage in conversation about the importance of community dialogue and not looking away. Voces, we have our work cut out for us, as do we all this year. I work in the communications department, so every night I go to bed thinking about how the Republican Party is spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on communication messages with certain attitudes about immigrants. And it's an opportunity for each of us to step into thinking about the effects that we can do. And I'm steeped in activism, but when I go places, I always tell people that you have the tools at your disposal now to make a difference and to do something. And we all respond in different ways. So thank you very much for being here tonight. That's a start. And I'm super excited for this. And yeah, let's have a good conversation. Oh, and sorry, to learn more about Voces de la Frontera, you can visit our website at vdlf.org. But we are located in Milwaukee. We are a statewide organization. So yeah, I encourage you to learn more, and you can see me after the talk too.
Thanks again to Voces de la Frontera for all your support. And now we would like to welcome Kushner. Kushner is here with his new book, Look Away, a true story of the murders, bombings, and far-right campaign to rid Germany of immigrants. Jacob Kushner is a Fulbright Germany scholar and a Logan Nonfiction Fellow, and he was the finalist for the Livingston Award in International Reporting. Tonight, he will be in conversation with Pablo Muirhead. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So great to see such a wonderful audience, so many familiar faces, so many faces from when Jacob was a student at Shorewood High School. When I met him, he was getting ready to go into the middle school. So I've just aged myself. So real quick, back in December, my son was touring colleges and he wanted to go to UW. We went to UW-Madison, so I wants to study global affairs. So I hopped on their website. I said, you know, who do I know on the faculty there? Maybe I know somebody. And sure enough, who is the distinguished visiting professor? Jacob Kushner. So I quick messaged him and told him that my son was studying in Germany. He was home for a few weeks. He said, he's studying in Germany. I said, yeah, you know, my kid's living down near the border, near Salzburg in Bavaria. And I too had studied in Germany. He's like, when did you study in Germany? I'm like in 1992. He's like, 1992? I'm like, you were in first grade, you know? And he said, I've got a book coming out about this period. And I told him about how my son is consistently profiled. Beautiful brown skinned boy. He's constantly being profiled, especially when he hops on a train in Salzburg to go into Germany. And he's got his 10-minute like interrogation that he gets from the police. So naturally, I was drawn and signed up. I was supposed to be sitting in the audience, and then Jacob was gracious enough to invite me to discuss this book with him, which is fabulous. It's so well documented. It's so well written. It serves as an alarm bell, not only for those in Germany, but for those of us here in the US. Because if a homegrown white terrorist group can run amok for so long in Germany, a country that prides itself in never repeating its history, what does that say about the US, which has never truly acknowledged our racist roots? And it's those connections that I look forward to chatting with you about tonight. As I said, I lived in Germany in 1992. My mother from Peru lived in Germany from 1962 to 65. And I share this not to give you my whole bio, but to share that my Peruvian, beautiful, short, brown mother lived in Germany in 1962 through 1965 and never sensed any hostility. But in 1992, when she came to visit me, she remembers being in the Munich Hauptbahnhof in the main train station and having two skinheads with their bomber jackets come up and shake the telephone booth and look at her with a crazed look on their face and then leave. And she was, her knees almost fell, out from under her. She had never experienced anything like that in Germany till 1992. And then, fast forward a few years, my wife and I were driving home from Berlin, back to Munich in my friend's car with Munich license plates. And ironically, we were not too far from Jena, where these three disgruntled youth that became homegrown white terrorists in Germany are from. And we remember saying, we're really tired. It's a long trip. Let's pull over and sleep. And we realized our German A is not that good. We're not from here. We're in the former East. We had a bad feeling and we just muscled through the drive. We were too scared because we knew what was happening in the East and also in the West, but mostly in the East. So, wow, Jacob, I met you in 1999. You and your moms came to SIS and I gave you guys a tour of the school. I was teaching Spanish at the time. Tell us how you stumbled upon this. You've done stories of migration and the Dominican Republic and Haiti. You're living in Africa now in Nairobi, Kenya. Tell us a little bit about what got you here. And
Absolutely. First of
Yeah.
all, thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you to Boswell and also Boswell for partnering with this event. We really appreciate that. And thank you to you, Pablo, for doing this and stepping up to do this. To answer your question of how I got here, though, you have to look out here because there are people I've known at every stage of my life. Some of them have known me some before I was able to form memories. So this is really what's done it. It's been people here who, both my parents and both others who have kind of instilled a sense of justice or a sense of anger at injustice. My teachers, my professors. So thank you guys all, my friends as well, of course. So thank you all for coming and for doing that and kind of getting me here. That's a round of applause to yourselves, first of all. Thank you. It's a lot of you in this room. Yeah, I think, actually, I mean, Spanish is one of the big reasons I'm where I am today. I was not very good at Spanish in high school, or at least it was my subject I struggled the most at. When I got to Madison, they had this program where, if you place into fourth semester Spanish and you take it, they give you all these credits, which you don't understand that you don't really need those credits. But anyways, took that, did that.
I'm going to interrupt you. You said you're not that good, but you tested in the fourth semester.
Well, okay.
Humility. It's a nice trait.
But I love Spanish class in high school, learning about the world. That's how I learned about the world. And so when I got to college, I knew already from learning from Profes Muirhead, Mary Pat Clausen, and Albertson and others, that I wanted to study abroad. And so I said, okay, I've been learning Spanish, struggling through it all this time. Let me use it. And I lived abroad in the Dominican Republic, lived with a host family. And that's actually a study abroad program where I was doing research on Dominican-Haitian relations. So this is my first real time researching xenophobia, was actually as a student at Madison when I was in the Dominican Republic looking at Dominican racism toward people of Haitian descent, and actually a court decision eventually that I would report on by Dominican Republic's Supreme Court to take away the nationality of many tens of thousands of people who were of Haitian ancestry. So these are, two people stuck on an island, and all of a sudden tens of thousands of them have no state. They're stateless now, to this day, many of them. And so, I think that time, really opened my eyes. I also met the foreign correspondent there, Jonathan Katz, for lunch, and he kind of showed me what being a foreign correspondent could be like. And so, yeah, by the time I finished at Madison in Latin American Studies and Journalism, I was eager to kind of get out into the world and try to do reporting. And moved on to Haiti, lived there for 2 years after Haiti's 2010 earthquake, investigating some things, and eventually found my way to grad school in New York, and then eventually to Nairobi, where I've been based lots of the last 10 years. So it was actually in Nairobi, getting to how this book came about, that I was working on a project on LGBTQ refugees in East Africa. So people fleeing their countries that are not at war, but because of who they are. I did a 3-year project with a photographer, Jake Naughton, who's also from here. And chronicling the plight of these people. And that's when I started to hear some news, just news in Germany about attacks against by Germans against immigrants. And here I was going around East Africa reporting on attacks against immigrants. And I started hearing about this happening in Germany. This was during the global refugee crisis and then the arrival of many asylum seekers to Germany. So I started going over to Germany on little Fulbright programs and other kind of institutions that gave me fellowships to go investigate these attacks. And that's when I heard about the NSU, which is the subject of this book.
No, thank you. So I came upon the NSU. Netflix had a mini series about them. It's no longer available, but I did watch it when shortly after it came out, and it was eye-opening. But it kind of fit what I understood reunification of Germany to be. 1 in 3 East Germans 30 years after reunification, as you report in your book, have expressed that only 1 in 3 are satisfied with reunification. So after reunification, there was a competition from the West and a rise in unemployment, and whom do we scapegoat? You can see the playbook right here in the USA. We've got an election coming up, and it's easy to scapegoat immigrants. And that same thing happened in Germany. And as early as the 90s, I remember Asylheime, like the refugee homes being burned, and refugees being attacked. I myself befriended a gentleman from Togo, and he and I painted a house together. And we were advised to take different routes to work every day because a Black guy and me riding our bikes to our paint job, we were clearly painting, we had painter clothes on, would draw attention that was unneeded. And then you fast forward, these kids would tell us a little bit about these NSU youth, Beate and the 2 Uves, and the context in which they were coming up in, and how they were radicalized, and how they were able to run amok for so long.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, it's really fascinating to hear your, personal perspectives and the stories you have from the 1990s there, because I, was not in Germany at that time. I only know it from the research. So this is, it's really interesting to hear these anecdotes. The 3, the people who would form the core of this terrorist group, the NSU, they met, in the 1990s in this town called Jena, philosopher's town, historically, beautiful town. But it was after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was a lot of upheaval, capitalism had just come to the East. But I think, maybe from what I had learned in school, my preconception of, Eastern Germany in the 1990s was, okay, yes, there's a lot of resentment against a lot of sorts of different people. But, maybe that's because there was high unemployment and there were all these economic conditions, and those things were true. But what I found out through my research is that, not just these 3, but all of their friends who, radicalized in the 1990s in Germany, they, were far better off than all of the immigrants they were attacking or scapegoating or that sort of thing. Also, these 3 who would become terrorists, they didn't particularly fit this mold of, oh, these people who maybe couldn't get jobs and they couldn't, succeed, and therefore they turned to radicalization or they turned to something else. That wasn't true for these 3 for the most part. I mean, they're a mix of people. So Uwe Bernhardt was a hard-headed kid who dropped out of school and, just committed lots of crimes, and that's what he, kind of chose, the sort of path he chose, not for any, it wasn't something that, his siblings or his parents did, or really some older kids he met did. But then Uwe Mundlos was the son of a professor, very brainy guy, would go on to college. He definitely never lacked for opportunities. And Beata Chepa was this daughter. She's the daughter of an immigrant, actually, herself, and from a Romanian father. And she I think they came to all of this, as you'll see in the book. I mean, they kind of come to all of this through teenagers, I think, wanting to rebel, wanting to blame somebody for anything at all. But in Germany at this time in the 1990s, if you wanted to be a teenager and you really wanted to push buttons and rebel, there was no more sensational way to do that than to become neo-Nazis, and that is what they did.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know, some of the laws in Germany about raising symbols of World War II, it's not only frowned upon, but it can land you in jail. I remember in 1993, I was back at UW Eau Claire. I had a German roommate, and I was taking a class on World War II, and the professor, to drive home a point, talked about Crystal Night, and then he threw out a Nazi flag over the students. And my fellow German, my roommate, just went blank. He had never seen one. He thought he was shocked. And it was the professor's intention, not to celebrate Nazism, but rather to scare us. And that was these symbols are, and you see in some of the protests and the marches, even especially in the 2000s, since in 2015 with the flood of migrants coming from places that we got involved in as a country. And my journalist friend in Munich, I remember him calling me in 2015, and he was with a group of German politicians. He was covering for the Tagesschau, which is kind of like their NPR. And he said, "I'm right here in Syria at a refugee camp. Thank you, your country." He said it facetiously. He said it sarcastically. You guys did this, and now you're not taking any of the refugees. And many of them went to Germany. So you watch some of the videos of the protests and the anti-immigrant. The xenophobia has even been elevated more since like 2015. Talk to us a little bit about how how you see it in your time there, and what parallels you might see in other countries.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, Germany, I mean, I was surprised to learn that Germany has long been a nation of immigrants in a way. In a way that when both East and Western Germany were bringing over immigrants from Turkey or Vietnam or that sort of thing, they were bringing them over as workers, as laborers. So they weren't really meant to integrate, but, that changed over the decades. And, of course, Germany was famous in 2014, 2016 during the global refugee crisis for allowing more than 1 million asylum seekers into Germany to claim asylum. That puts Germany up with the other countries in the world that take most of the world's refugees, which are, Jordan, Turkey, countries like that, neighboring countries to these conflicts. Of course, the United States takes, relatively few, certainly relative to what Germany did, for example, during the refugee crisis. And so, yeah, that's one thing. So what you'll do is, when you read the book, is you'll meet some of these these immigrant families, rather, some of whom are refugees and actually come from Turkey, in this case, moving to find safety from Turkish-Kurdish fighting that was happening over there. And you kind of meet a couple of these characters, including a woman you'll meet named Gamze Kubasik, who spoke with me at length for the book, and to which I'm very grateful, about her family story. Because unfortunately it's not a good one. It was for many, many years, but her father is actually someone who would become targeted by this terrorist group, the NSU. And through a number of interviews, I got to learn about her family story, but also about what happened to her, both during, the times of a time that her father was murdered, but also what happened to her immediately after that at the hands of police.
So tell us a little bit about, these three youth met in about 1991, but they went on this killing spree for years. How did they go undetected for so long?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, as I won't say everything that's in the book, but I can give an overview that, like, these three, at some point, something drastic happens and they end up going into the underground and living underground and hiding from police. Okay. And so during that time, they had a lot of support from entire networks of far-right extremists or neo-Nazis. And so people renting apartments for them, helping them get weapons for the crimes they were to commit. The book is a bit of a, there's a lot of crime in the book, and all sorts, both racist and xenophobic crime, also ordinary crime, or sort of. They robbed 15 banks in the 2000s in Germany to fund their terrorism, to build the bombs that they built, to all of this. And so, it was a highly coordinated. These three were the main people in the group, but there were many people who contributed. Everything from apartments to renting the equipment they needed, to giving them train passes or IDs so they could go in for a doctor's visit when they were sick under someone else's name and not get caught. So, they were savvy about it, but also, as you'll find out in the book, one of the main reasons that allowed them to get away with their terrorism so long is because of the mistakes and the inactions, both inactions and negligence by the police and also by Germany's intelligence agencies. So I think it's a bit of both of those things is how they end up getting away with these crimes for so long. Yeah.
And that's the part that really disrupted my view of Germany, having grown up, with many Jewish friends and studied World War II at length and just been very moved and shooken by that horrible chapter and being drawn to post World War II Germany's, who I think my experience is emblematized by one of the people in your book, Catherine Koenig, the granddaughter of a former SS officer, who was very much like many of my friends that were not necessarily grandchildren of SS officers, but everybody had a grandfather or somebody who was complicit. And her main message, and she fought hard against this group, was, I don't feel guilty for what happened, but I feel responsible to make sure it never happens again. And that's the experience I've had with my friends in Germany. So I have this very beautiful image of Germany that I wish I had about our own country, where we would feel maybe not guilty about slavery and what we did to native peoples and what we continue doing, but responsible to make sure it stops and it never occurs again. And I don't think as a country we've achieved that. So this book really disrupted my view. But tell us a little bit about how the investigations went in the East, and then when some of those murders started happening in cities like Munich and Dortmund, which are in the western part, and how can you talk us through the blind eye that they turned? Tell us more about this, because this is really difficult.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the most startling things to me when researching this book was the assumptions by the police after each one of these murders or each one of these bombings. The assumption that you'll see when you read it, that this must be the work of immigrants, actually, the crimes themselves, that this looks like some sort of drug deal going wrong. This looks like, and so, as I think anyone who reads the book will find out, just at every step of the way, different police departments in different parts of Germany where these crimes occurred, each reacted in remarkably similar ways based on their kind of preconceptions and their biases about what violent crime looked like and what sorts of people commit it. To the point that whenever there were clues or witnesses who reported seeing, two white men cycling away on bikes or something from a crime scene, the police would write it off or treat them as potential witnesses who they wish they had a chance to interview, but not as suspects, because they were zeroed in on the idea that these crimes had to be committed by immigrants. In fact, one of the bombings that occurred, within minutes, a police communique went out saying a terrorist attack has occurred on such and such street in Cologne. And then the next one that went out within an hour revised that and said an organized crime event had taken place. And so even though the initial reaction with this bombing looks like terrorism, the initial kind of reaction was a terrorist attack has happened. Within the hour, they had revised that and said, oh, well, the victim, this was an immigrant neighborhood. It couldn't have been a terrorist attack exactly. It must have been something else. It must have been some sort of criminal activity. So you'll see that again and again if you take a look at the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So without giving too much away of the book, and I strongly recommend you read it, because the parallels to what's happening in other countries are very startling, and you pull no punches. He doesn't wait for the reader to make the connections. In the prologue right away, tell us what drew you to just not let the reader wait to make these connections for themselves, because I saw it in the title, I saw it in the subtitle, and then I started reading the book. I'm like, all right, Jacob, you're not pulling any punches. You're not, you're driving it home. Tell us what drove that.
Definitely, yeah. There's a brief prologue that it kind of, sets up the book, as Paolo was mentioning. And really what I wanted to do is just plant the seed of the idea of, what's going to happen throughout the book, how to frame it, how to think about it, because I don't think we do that. In fact, I know we don't do that in terms of framing these sorts of things, far right terrorism as terrorism or as domestic extremism. There's loads of evidence to get to later in the book that kind of looks at the very end at the United States and how, in the United States, actually, let me give an anecdote that isn't in the book that kind of speaks to this, that I try to signal kind of in the very front in terms of what white terrorism or domestic terrorism or far right terrorism is, which is that I was interviewing the head of an intelligence agency in Germany. So this is like an FBI, like a regional FBI office, let's say. And I was interviewing him about, and he's actually very controversial. He had, arguably should have maybe known more about that this was going on and done more to stop it. But anyways, I'm interviewing him about terrorism and how hard it, he was kind of saying that the intelligence agencies was so hard for them to think of this as domestic terrorism because it looked like organized crime to them and whatnot. But he did tell me this anecdote about coming to the United States, and he visited the Oklahoma City bombing, where two far-right terrorists, Timothy McVeigh and John Nichols, committed this, terrible bombing that is one of our most notable kind of incidents of white terrorism in the United States. And he went to the gift shop there, and he said he looked at all the books in the gift shop, and he found books on terrorism in the Middle East and books on 9/11 conspiracy theories and all of these sorts of books. And there wasn't a single book about the type of terrorism that had happened right there at the site for which the gift shop existed. And so, he asked me, what's easier for a public to think that you guys are, that your neighbors and friends are radicalizing around you, or not just neighbors and friends, but people in your country, or to think that you are the good guys and just assume that. And so, I think what this case has forced Germany to realize something that I don't think one particular episode in the US has forced us to realize. Maybe January 6th came closest, about the sort of far right threat that does exist in Western countries, and how, I think I also note throughout the book how it's not just, by the way, authorities getting things wrong, it's journalists. I mentioned all the times that journalists get things wrong, including, one of Germany's leading news magazines, which was describing a recent coup attempt in Germany. Germany had its own coup attempt in 2022. It was dozens of people were collecting arms, siphoning them away from the military. A leader of Germany's far-right political party was involved, and they were going to overthrow Germany's government in a coup and install this aristocrat prince as the head of the new government. This is just the Reichsbürger group, they were called. And he, this prince, journalists described him as, wearing a tweed jacket and this aristocrat, and, not exactly what you'd expect a terrorist to look like. And as I note in the book, that is exactly what terrorists in Germany look like. In Germany, as in the United States, most terrorists are male and white, right wing and white. And so that's why in the very beginning of the book, I tried to plant that idea, listing a lot of the attacks we've seen in America that we don't necessarily think first of as being a suicide attack, or we don't call them suicide attacks when they're by white people. But pointing out a lot of these attacks that we think of as mass shootings or something, but of course, the motive was terrorism. And so that's why I do kind of signal that in the book, so that when people are looking at Germany for the rest of the book, they sort of have that in mind from the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I was watching last night, something on Deutsche Welle about these incidents and kind of preparing for today. And one of the things they mentioned was, the pairing of discontent with the political system and the rise of ethno-nationalism seem to be key ingredients leading to these acts of violence. And in there, they also talked about der große Austausch, the replacement theory, which we see heralded here in the United States. Talk to us a little bit about that and those parallels.
Absolutely. There's a great book called Bringing the War Home by Catherine Belew that, really looks into in Chicago at the University of Chicago, who, really does a wonderful job looking at like the history of the far right extremist movement in the United States and, what their beliefs are and where they come from. So this replacement theory, a lot of these far right ideas bounce back and forth over time between the US and Germany. So, some of the you'll find out in the book that there's a character here who's kind of involved, becomes a far right informant, a really nasty guy who is infatuated with the American KKK. And he actually starts a magazine called Feuerkreuz, which means Fiery Cross, which was actually the name of the KKK's magazine back in the 1920s and however long since. And so he fills it with, actually he sells KKK, apparel and all of these things. I mean, really infatuated. He actually brings a KKK leader over in the 1990s from the US, and the two of them burn a cross on German television. And, here, of course, in the United States, burning crosses has been a signal of that type of white supremacy for a long time, but it hadn't been in Germany. I mean, burning crosses in Europe has, pagan traditions going back, hundreds of years, but it was never used in that way, actually, until this was all media outlets just televised this nationally, and it caught on among the far right in Germany, and the terrorists in the book and lots of other far right Germans end up kind of replicating this very American sort of signaling of fear and whatnot. So a lot of these ideas kind of bounce back and forth, between these different countries, and now, of course, with the advent of the internet, even more so. But
Yeah, and a lot of these groups, as you wrote about, and I've been, doing my own research, will lay dormant and wait for these opportunities to attack, to kill, to wreak havoc, to terrorize. And I'm so grateful that these three were not living in the United States, where access to guns is incredibly easy, because they had to work really hard to get the few guns they had that were used repeatedly. And it makes me worry about our own country and this group that's not so dormant and is gaining their voice and feeling entitled and okay to speak their mind and say things that maybe 10, 15 years ago, 5 years ago, 8 years ago, we might not have publicly said, but thought. And then I think about our country, where access to guns is very different. What are your thoughts about this dormant group that's not too dormant? They're waking, even though they don't like to talk about waking, being woke, but they're not going to be asleep for long, and it is of concern.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think what surprised me doing all the research in Germany is, if this can happen for, arguably 10, 13 years in Germany without anyone, any authorities figuring out what's going on, then it can easily happen in the United States. Whereas you mentioned, because of access to weapons, as you mentioned, because of all the far right militias that do exist in this country, I mean, this thing could be going on as we speak, frankly, and we may not know about it. And that's actually something that I get into toward the end of the book is, that our leaders have known for decades that domestic extremism is our nation's greatest threat. In fact, it was in a few months after 9/11, the FBI actually took the occasion to inform the Senate Intelligence Committee and remind them that just because 9/11 happened, we need to remember that the Islamists are not our biggest threat. And imagine the FBI, this is the same FBI that, to make terrorism cases after that would spend years in trapping Muslims and setting up, creating their own terrorist plots, and then bringing a Muslim who is maybe, mentally unstable or something into a plot, convicting them of terrorism to get terrorism charges. This is that same FBI actually told Congress after 9/11 that, oh no, like, remember that we actually need to pay attention to our domestic extremists. And so, this is something that's been known time and again under the Obama administration. There was a report released in 2009 under DHS that far-right groups were actively trying to recruit men and women in uniform among the U.S. Armed Services and veterans. And that report was so shocking to some politicians and some media outlets that there was a huge firestorm of backlash against the report. And the Obama administration actually withdrew that report, and then reassigned those people to Islamist terror, and gave into that pressure as well. And so this sort of idea that our law enforcement knows about this danger, and of course it's not just law enforcement. The SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center, says that not just far right hate, but actually anti-immigrant hate is the most extreme. Anti-immigrant hate groups are the most extreme of all of the hate groups in America today, and that's the SPLC, which monitors all of that. And so it's very frightening to think about the sorts of things that are happening. And if you read the book, you'll see kind of these lists of attacks that I go through, that white terrorist attacks that have happened here. But then you also wonder about the ones that could be underway or that could happen, because time and again we are not kind of focusing on those. And I do give some recommendations toward the end of the book of some things that legislators have tried to do, like pass the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which was introduced many years in a row, but kept being dying in the Senate usually. That would have because basically every time we have a presidential shift, what will happen is the current president will either create programs to monitor domestic extremism or cancel the programs of his predecessor, and that is not a way to stop or monitor for serious, violent threats. Is not just do it for 4 years and then don't do it for 4 years. And so you really need legislation that is going to make this sort of thing more permanent. So there are, solutions already on the table. Also, the Justice Department, has a lot it could do. I think it charged 400 people for supporting international terrorism, like material support to terrorism since 9/11. It charged one person with material support for domestic terrorism. And so, again, I mean, even a lot of the Department of Justice is not even using the tools it does have at its disposal as well. So anyways, sorry for the long answer, but yeah.
They came here to hear you speak, right? So you mentioned the FBI, and in the book, without giving too much away, the FBI actually played a role in recognizing some of the patterns that finally drew German intelligence. I have to put that in quotes because once you read the book, you'll understand why. Or the police, the detectives, and drew their attention and ultimately led to shutting them down. But some of the recommendations you just gave on what can be done, what is being done in Germany? Because collectively, I had a conversation yesterday with the same journalist friend. I said, "Hey, tomorrow I'm going to be talking to this friend about this book. Talk to me about it because I don't think I have a real clear understanding." And he just went silent for a while and was embarrassed and told me, this kind of everything that you wrote about in the book, but there's a big sense of shame and like, how did we miss this? But the next question is, what are they doing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I mean, since the NSU, there has been this sort of reckoning in Germany. Almost everyone in Germany has heard about this case, right? It was a huge deal in Germany. And there's been a reckoning of, what does this say about our institutions after, however many, 80 years after the Holocaust, almost our institutions still racist? Are our police forces not just, is this not just, an example, but do we have racism, not among every single person, but institutionally that, how can we miss all all these murders and bombings over all of these years if it's just, one or two people who have racist ideas? No, maybe there's something institutionally wrong. And so there's been this big reckoning in Germany about that. And that's the reason we actually know about so many more plots today that have come to light since the NSU's time. There was a German soldier who was siphoning away weapons, and he was creating this whole plot. He was posing as a refugee and commit a terrorist attack and then blame it on a Syrian refugee, whose identity he had already stolen, to incite a race war against refugees. He was found out about because, Germany is doing detective, or actually, well, to be fair, I think this was in Vienna that the Vienna police found a handgun he had stashed in an airport bathroom of all places. But then German authorities took it seriously once they found out about that. There have been this Reichsbürger plot that I mentioned with the whole coup attempt. We know about these things. I mean, there might be more that we don't know about, but we know about these ones because there is work being done. Because of the NSU, there were some small changes made to legislation in terms of prosecuting things that might have previously been prosecuted as hate crimes, but as terrorism. And so there was a terrorist group that I reported on in Freital, just outside Dresden in Germany, that was committing attacks against Eritrean and Syrian refugees in, let's say 2015, 16, 17 maybe. And I was looking into that, and those folks, 5 members of that group, ended up being convicted of terrorism for setting off sort of firework built bombs inside the windows of a few of these refugee shelters where people were living, and they wouldn't probably have been charged with terrorism before. So there are small things being learned. There's a lot that's not being learned, I think, in terms of the intelligence agencies. I just wrote a story for Foreign Policy magazine about the head of Germany's intelligence agency, like the equivalent of head of the FBI, is now under surveillance for he particularly being involved or connected to, not involved, let me say connected to far right extremists. this. And so, you know, there is within certain realms in Germany, there has not, and I would say the intelligence agencies are one, there's a lot of leftover ideas from the Gestapo and then from the Stasi in terms of these vast apparatuses of informants that are still used to this day. And so two of those informants are main characters in the book, and you kind of see sort of the, well, you'll see for yourself sort of the problems that arise when we kind of over rely on far right informants the same way here law enforcement often gives too much power, I think, and weight to informants here as well.
Towards the end of the book, you have this poignant statement. The NSU, by one of the victim's children, said the NSU murdered my father, but the investigators ruined his honor by murdering him a second time. That highlights the profound impact on victims' families. And that was, once you read the book and you tell story after story of these murders, and then the investigations that happened, where who was being investigated? The victims' families, that go as far as Turkey to question and find out, to the point that even some of their own family members believed that maybe my uncle was involved in the heroin drug trade, and tarnished people's reputations. And it still seems, and the feeling from one of the main people whose father was killed was that not enough was done to salvage the reputation, even at the end, after the hearings, which you, I think, attended. Some of them. Tell us a little bit about that, and bring in, you know, your experience sitting in these trials back in 2018 or so.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of lawyers in the room who might be interested. I was fascinated by this case in Germany. The trial of one of the main characters in the book, Beate Zschäpe, and then 4 other characters who were part of the NSU, the terrorist group. That trial lasted for 5 years. It was a trial of all 5 at once. And I attended certain key days of it. I did not attend a lot of it in total, but I attended some key days when some of the characters in my book were testifying. But yeah, I mean, this trial was massive. It was in this huge hall in Munich. Something interesting that I don't know if we do here in any capacity, but each of the victims' families, actually each member of each daughter of a man who was killed, or wife, for example, got to have their own lawyer who was a victim's advocate lawyer. So they're at trial able to make motions to advocate for that, in addition to the prosecutors and the defense. So there was, you know, an army of 60 something of those lawyers. And then, of course, you know, the defendants had multiple attorneys. And so it was really interesting to see this. There were seats reserved for the press. There are some German journalists and activists who attended every single day for 5 years to write everything down, because they don't have an official transcript. So someone has to go and I don't know what the reasoning is that if it's for that, but they don't have a transcriber. So you know, journalists, you know, were covering this every single day. And so, you know, in Germany, this was a big deal. There was a lot of news attention to this, and I, you know, got to attend some of the trial and kind of see and be there for the final day, the verdict day, which you'll come across as a sort of a certain moment in the book, a sort of climax of that trial and what ends up happening. Yeah, it was really interesting to actually see that justice process, and yet speak to family members of the victims who themselves weren't satisfied, because of the 5 people on trial, none of those 5 people were intelligence agents. None of them were police. No intelligence agent or police officer was ever charged with negligence or anything. It was not even an informant was charged, and in fact, there were informants who, you know, perjured themselves at trial, but whose testimony was allowed to stand. And so I think ultimately these families didn't feel like justice was served because because there was no reckoning, let's say, no legal reckoning for the authorities themselves. But
Yeah, absolutely. Incredibly well written, well documented. Your citations, everything. It's Mr. Halloran back there, your Ripples editor, would be proud. So it's not that I've run out of questions, because I could talk forever with you about your experiences, but we definitely want to create space for those of you in the audience to ask some questions. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and I can maybe come to you with the mic or not, or you can just project your voice.
please.
So you're sitting in front of Pittsburgh crime section. I don't know if you realize. And I was wondering, I live in a neighborhood where they do the Jeffrey Dahmer tours. sarcasm and the romanticism that we, especially in the US, have for certain criminals, and how that kind of maybe played into what you saw in Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, in Germany, this, as you'll see through the book, this really plays out in the press and among not, these same biases the police had, the journalists had. And so there are headlines that are almost poking fun in the way that headlines sometimes do, but of murders and of, these calling these killings, the string of killings, the kebab killings, after like Turkish kind of kebabs or something. There's some terrible headlines and terrible editorial decisions that are made that I try to point out throughout the book. But there is, a public fascination. It's not just the police. I mean, the police are members of the public. It's a public fascination with the idea of these, whoever's committing these attacks as, being, how did they get away with it? That sort of thing, the true crime intrigue. And, I go back and forth about how much of this is, our interest in true crime podcasts, which I share, and books and these sorts of things, I think is really critical that any podcast we're listening to, books that are true crime are ideally being done with the consent of some of the victims, and at the very least, giving a lot of attention to that. I actually didn't move ahead with this book for many years because I was waiting to see if one of the families would end up speaking with me, and they were very sick of speaking to the press. They had never, no, I don't know if anyone of them had spoken to the press at length, as Gamze Kubasik ended up doing with me over many interviews. But I think they were very sick of just kind of, fleeting attention and that sort of thing, and the intrigue, all the intrigue with Beata Zschäpe, one of the main terrorists, who, when the trial started, the newspapers would call her the Nazi bride, and that was her defense, in fact. And she used that in her defense, that she was just a housewife and, had nothing to do, and she was trapped by these, men who were the actual terrorists and whatnot. But the public's biases and the media's biases played into that, and, her defense, frankly. And so, I think it's really important to, it's a natural desire to learn about these sorts of crimes, but to think about what the effect is on the victims. And I had an interesting moment, which I guess I'll share, where journalists, this situation was turned on a group of journalists who I went to graduate school and journalism with in New York. And, we, as a job, we had all, reported on crime and attacks. And then, unfortunately, a few years after we graduated, one of our friends and colleagues and classmates was murdered in Denmark, Sweden. And, Kim Wall was murdered, and the person who murdered her did it in a very gruesome way, murdering her on a submarine when she had gone along with him to do a story about his home-built submarine. And suddenly, all of us as friends of Kim's and classmates of Kim's, saw the news media covering that and covering him, this crazy inventor, murderer, misogynist, who and all the attention going to him instead of to our friend Kim. And I think, it shouldn't take that to convince the media, but it also shouldn't take that to convince the public to not sensationalize the perpetrators at the expense of the victims. And actually, I was reading up a little bit on, there was a New Yorker piece that published a few days after Wisconsin's white terrorist attack at the Sikh temple in 2012 in Oak Creek, when this white man who had also radicalized in the military went into that temple thinking people to be Muslims, and murdered people and shot up worshipers at that temple here, and then in a suicide attack. He this New Yorker writer was a member, actually a Sikh professor at Notre Dame, wrote this piece days later that I only just discovered about how I think it was right after the Aurora, Colorado shooting, and all of the attention was on that. There was fleeting attention to this, but no follow up in the media and that sort of thing. And there was just very little public interest in a very similar shooting, but this one being a white terrorist attack. And maybe in Milwaukee, or maybe it's something that we've heard of, but nationally there wasn't that sort of attention. So, I think this same sort of bias as well. There was a study recently that mainstream combined newspapers, radio, and TV stations give 5 times as much attention to far-right to Islamist attacks than to far-right attacks, even though, as we know, there are more far-right attacks today than Islamist ones in the United States. And so, anyway, sorry for the very long answer to the question, but I do, hope that's something that I learned through this process and working speaking with some of the families, is that they feel left behind by the way the public and the media often, focus on the perpetrators instead of on the victims. But, yeah. Thanks, guys.
I actually worked for the Commission for Racial Equality
Oh, wow.
in the I worked for the Commission for Racial Equality in the 80s, and we started to see the rise of the far right and the anti-immigrant there. And when you're telling these stories, I just wondered, did you get any sense that this was a European thing as well, especially with France? And yeah, I just wondered about
That's a great
that.
question.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I wish I could ask you that question and see sort of, my focus has been pretty strictly on Germany, but yeah, I mean, we talk on, Europe. There are European Parliament elections coming up. I mean, this is a very interesting time for Europe in terms of many countries have anti-immigrant parties that are about to take more seats in the European Parliament than ever before, including Germany, and a lot going on. As far as far-right terrorist attacks, I really didn't focus too much on the ones in the UK and France, but I'm actually going to be going over to, well, Germany specifically, but I'm hopefully will have dialogue with some people in some of these other countries when I go over and do some talks over there about, whether or not this is something that looks familiar to people in the UK and looks familiar to people in France, or whether this is a different category of attacks or terrorism than people are used to there. But it's, it's something that it's mostly that doing this work in Germany, I ended up recognizing more and more attacks that I had heard of as mass shootings or whatever, and recognizing those as far-right attacks here, since that's what I was familiar with. But, and yeah, as you see in the book, there are, a great many of those. But no, it's a very interesting time, in Germany and across Europe with just the popularity of anti-immigrant sentiment right there now being very much, rising, just like there's high anti-immigrant sentiment here. But yeah, thanks. Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the question is about, far-right music, and, kind of the role of music and kind of culture in this identity, in this sort of identity. I was fascinated because, again, I've been a foreign correspondent, and that's how I came to this. So frankly, I haven't investigated this sort of thing here, but the question, so just to briefly, in the book, you'll kind of go inside some of these neo-Nazi music scenes, and also the far left, the leftist kind of punk music scenes, and kind of see how, these cultural scenes are how people form their identity. And there's a lot of researchers out there who, attribute a lot of what ends up becoming radicalization and extremism to people at first just looking for identity. And I do think that's true for the three main terrorists in this book. They like listening to this music. They like dressing in these certain ways. It started with that. Frankly, it was an outlet to identify with other people, and then of course they took it a different direction. But I was fascinated to watch a documentary film by Talia Levine. I'm forgetting the name. Her book is called Culture Warlords. I forget. It's about, but her film, she has this documentary film where she ends up interviewing around the U.S. Different white supremacists, including Richard Spencer and these things. But she actually has a whole segment in the film that takes place in River West here in Milwaukee, where she interviews this guy who used to be a member of a neo-Nazi band in River West, who talks on camera about how they would have these shows and rile people up to then go out to the streets of River West in the 1990s and beat people up on the streets, people who looked like they didn't belong, people who were not white, that sort of thing. I was shocked I didn't know this had happened right here in our hometown, actually in the neighborhood where I was born, although I didn't grow up there. And so anyways, a lot of, I'd be curious to learn more about how the far right, or music scenes, have been used, by certain, by individuals, or have been used to, kind of build up anti-immigrant hate, for example. I'd be very particularly interested in. But I was stunned to learn that this neo-Nazi music scene existed right here in Milwaukee during that same time that these folks in Germany were radicalizing. More questions?
You want to come up here, Dave, or just project?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the group was, I mean, you'll see in the book, and you'll come to your own conclusions, I think, because about how big the group was, but there were, I guess the spoiler is there were 5 people put on trial, but that was not everybody. And I include some characters who you meet throughout the book, some of these informants who I think you'll come to the conclusion that I believe should have, were part of the group. And so, as far as the group, yeah, anyway, I'll let you guys kind of come to your own conclusions on that because that's very much debated still in Germany. As for, I'm sorry, your second part of your question, I just got
It
distracted.
was about government officials kind of.
Okay. So actually, I have, thank you. I have an article that just came out, I think today in in Noema magazine about Germany's far-right anti-immigrant party, the AfD. And so back when I was on a Fulbright fellowship in Germany in 2017, 2018, I started going to these party meetings in Berlin. I was fascinated by how an anti-immigrant party, a far-right party, could get so many votes in a city thought of as very liberal, and that was 225,000 votes in the 2017 election in Berlin, is what the AfD got, which is the AfD is pretty much just an anti-immigrant party. That's like their main kind of platform, I would say. And so, I started going to their meetings. I started attending celebrations that they sort of had, kind of insider celebrations when they were winning these elections. And I went on a tour I asked, basically, the AfD was putting all this out about how Berlin is falling apart because of immigrants. This was after the more than 1 million asylum seekers did arrive to Germany. And so I went to the party and I said, in Berlin, the headquarters, and I said, is there someone who'd give me a tour of the worst hit neighborhoods by immigrants and show me what is falling, show me how this apocalypse is coming about? And so I went on that tour, and asked, just had a whole day of asking questions of this person, and I supplemented with other interviews I'd done with the AfD there. And then I returned to those same neighborhoods with refugees who were living in those neighborhoods to ask them. And for example, this AfD tour guide would say, oh, look, here's a bridge where, here's a park where, Muslim men are just hanging out loitering. And then I'd go back with the refugees and they'd say, and it would tell me, those are just families having picnics. But, I mean, it's again, so it's actually I think the headline they went with is something like, inside the imagination of the anti-immigrant party in Berlin. And so although you won't find this in the book necessarily, this is some more recent reporting that I've done that kind of looks at the relationship between rhetoric and reality among the anti-immigrant kind of party in that city. So yeah, if you look at NOEMA magazine, I think that's out today. But no, thank you guys very much for your questions. I'd love to, first of all, before I totally wrap up, I want to thank Pablo for sharing his experience and his questions, and Voces for sponsoring the event, and Boswell for having us. So let's just give them all a round of applause. And yeah, I just want to thank you guys all so much for coming. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here, some faces I don't know.